would you like to introduce yourself?
Right, yes. My name's Sandra Gidley. I chair the English Pharmacy Board at the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, which is a bit of a convoluted title, but we are where we are. The English Board basically deals with health policy in England, and because we have a devolved structure, so there are also boards in Wales and Scotland, but on GB-wide policy issues we would try and have a joined-up approach, which can be sometimes a bit weighty. I'm a community pharmacist by background, and I've chaired the board for 4 years. I don't know if it's a declaration of interest. Simon Wales' company, Luther Pendragon, provides the secretariat to the All-Party Pharmacy Group, of which the Royal Pharmaceutical Society is a sponsor, I think is the correct term. And that's probably about it, really. I've taken an active interest in the valproate issue for the last 4 years, really, and also sit on various bodies at the MHRA, which now deals with this. So I've probably had a fairly close interest for that length of time.
Right.
So do you want me to just say a little bit more about the organisation, just to clarify for the record who we are and what we do? The Royal Pharmaceutical Society is the professional leadership body for pharmacists. Up until the year 2010, there was a joint regulator and leadership body, and the government of the day decided, in my view quite rightly, that the regulatory function should be separated from the professional leadership function. So we're a fairly new organisation, and the regulation side is now in the province of the General Pharmaceutical Council, so probably won't be able to answer any historic questions about governance and from regulators' perspective. And also, just to clarify, the word pharmaceutical can be a bit misleading. It implies links with the pharmaceutical industry, which we don't really have. We are occasionally sponsored by a company for a piece of work, and that is generally open and transparent. We represent pharmacists from all aspects of the profession, from hospital, community, also those in academia, and the emerging roles such as pharmacists who are based in GP surgeries. And we also have a section of the membership which represents pharmaceutical scientists. Now, they are not on the register, but they generally have a medicines related degree in some shape or form, and generally work in the pharmaceutical industry. So that's generally who we try and represent. Right, do you need to know any more about us? Right.
I think we've got the gist.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
So, do you want a history of how I know that the organisation has been involved in the valproate issue? Because that's been our main focus. We haven't really had any dealings with the pelvic meshes, and actually very little with Primodos.
Just on Primodos, and it's only one question I've got on Primodos, but I just wondered, you probably know about the way that it was dispensed by doctors as a free sample that was given to women to test whether they were pregnant or not.
Yes.
And since that time, presumably practices and things have changed, and perhaps you'd like to tell us a bit about that.
A bit about what? Practice of free medicines. I mean, generally, well, going back to when I was first on the register, there was a rather unhealthy, it's fair to say that the pharmaceutical industry wasn't very well regulated. And this is anecdotal, but I saw it all the time in practice. The pharma companies would often give doctors free samples of various drugs so that they tried them out, and they were far less regulated than they are today with regard to what incentives might be given for prescribing, shall we say. And so 40 years ago, when I first came on the register, we were in a very, very different position to we are today. So all of that has now been tightened up. Free samples are not generally allowed. And I don't think any GP who was doing things by the book today would give out anything like that to test, particularly for a pregnant woman. It's almost unthinkable.
Right, well that's very comforting, I must say. So can I just ask you then about pharmacists and their role in protecting patient safety? We've heard from patient groups that the pregnancy prevention programme for valproate hasn't been implemented consistently across the country. And can you tell us a little bit about how that compliance should be ensured?
Well, from a pharmacy perspective, the pharmacists obviously don't implement the pregnancy prevention programme. But if a woman is having a sodium valproate prescription dispensed at her community pharmacy, there are certain procedures that should be followed. So most important is that we check whether the woman has a plan in place, and obviously that has to be done yearly, and it's fairly new, so getting the message across to everybody has been quite a challenge. But what should happen is the pharmacist or a member of the pharmacy team would have a conversation to ask whether the woman was aware of the risks of valproate and whether she was on a pregnancy prevention plan. There is a booklet that should be given out, and there is a card that the booklet only has to be given out once, but the card should be given out at every dispensing, and it's an aid memoir. And also the packs that are given out should have the pictogram on, which depicts a heavily pregnant lady with a cross, which it could look as though you should say don't get pregnant, but I think the message is don't take during pregnancy. Now, those conversations should be recorded, and most pharmacists do. I work as a locum, so I've been kind of spot checking this. It's my little hobby horse when I go in. I think the record keeping is happening. What is sometimes not happening, if I'm brutally honest, is occasionally the card isn't given out a second time, or the packs aren't dispensed in the packs with the pictogram on. They may be redispensed into a white pack. There are stickers available from the manufacturers, and these should be affixed. But I think the differential is, from talking to the people who have queried why they're not doing it, is the staff say, well, they've had the cards, they've had the leaflets, so surely they know we've made a record. And talking to the patient groups, they are very clear that the message needs to be given every time, because they say that sometimes part of the condition is short-term memory problems, memory loss. But that little part of the story does not seem to have been communicated to pharmacy teams in its entirety. It's quite a difficult message to get across, because actually some women who are living with epilepsy might be quite offended at the idea that they might not remember from 1 month to the next. So it's quite a delicate area. But generally there is a good awareness of this in pharmacies, and there have also been a couple of audits to audit the women coming in and check whether they've had a plan. Now, we produced a flow sheet. You've probably seen this, the valproate supply pathway, and that's quite clear that if the woman is not on a plan, she should be referred back. But medicine should be dispensed, because there are dangers to a woman living with epilepsy in not taking the medicine.
Can I just ask then, two things arise in my mind. First of all, I think you've got pharmacists who are prescribers.
Yes.
So from the point of view of those people, and I imagine it's a small minority of the workforce, do they have the patient record? Do they have information about the patient?
Right, so there are pharmacist prescribers, and they are in many settings. There are relatively few in community pharmacy, and most would only work within their sphere of competence. So usually when a pharmacist becomes a prescriber, it's in a particular area of medicine, and it's only when they can demonstrate competency in other areas that they would extend that in any shape or form. It is extremely unlikely that there may be one somewhere, so I'm not saying never, but it's extremely unlikely that there would be a community pharmacist in the role of prescribing sodium valproate. And if they were based in the community, it is unlikely that they would have access to the medical notes. There are a small handful of pharmacies around the country that do. It's possible that a pharmacist in a hospital setting who's a specialist in this area would prescribe, but they would have access to the notes in that case.
Right. Because I was involved with a committee that were looking at specialisms in pharmacy and with pharmacists, and I remember it was on PD, Parkinson's disease. They were looking at specialist pharmacists for that. But I take your point that they're likely to be in a hospital setting as opposed to in the community. We've heard from the patient groups that what you have described in terms of the leaflet going out, the packs, some of them are just white and they haven't got the warnings on them. So we've heard from them, and they've done a survey, and it shows really that there are, and they've videoed it so we can see exactly what's been happening or hasn't been happening. And I'm just wondering, from the point of view of your organisation, and I do understand you're not a regulator, but what can you do to ensure that the pharmacists are fully aware of what should be happening for women with epilepsy and who are taking sodium valproate?
Well, we have done quite a lot over the years. Before even there was ministerial interest in this subject, we had produced a briefing note on valproate because we noticed that the advice about the risks had changed and felt that was appropriate. That would have been communicated to pharmacists generally via email. And not all pharmacists are members of the professional body, sadly. We have over half the register, but not everybody would necessarily see that. But we did also, we regularly meet with the superintendent of pharmacists, and at one of the meetings in 2015, I actually highlighted this issue, and they referred it to the Community Pharmacy Patient Safety Group, headed by Janice Perkins, and looked at what was possible. I have to say, some companies responded very enthusiastically to try and do something. Not all did, but there was actually, with the patient safety group, an opportunity to have another part of the system looking at it, if you like. And that group has representatives on it from a lot of large multiples. So they've done some work to try and disseminate. The problem, I think, is in practical terms that sometimes this information only goes out once or twice. And it is the usual, it's not an excuse, it's just the reality these days. The paper overload in a busy community pharmacy, plus a lot of electronic materials that come your way, and sometimes trying to work out which actually is the most important and the most relevant. But we also worked with the pharmacy media to run a number of articles around this issue, around one of the epilepsy awareness days. So there was quite a lot of information going out at the time, and there have been reminders since. I'm also aware that the General Pharmaceutical Council wrote to all pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, reminding them of the change in the dispensing of valproate. And I think that had an impact, because people generally read things from the General Pharmaceutical Council, because if you don't adhere to what they say, then you may lose your livelihood. And the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer has also contacted all pharmacists in various ways. So there has been quite a lot of effort to raise awareness of this.
Thank you very much for that. I think one of the great strengths of community pharmacy is that they can double check the prescription that has come from the doctor. And if they are well known in that community, I can understand a lot aren't, because if they're working for a big company, they may move around the different pharmacies within the company. But is there an alert system that the pharmacist will have if the woman is within the age of being pregnant, 16, whatever it is, to 50? Do they get any sort of alert like that?
I'm not seeing an alert that links, it's quite difficult to link the age to the sex and the drug. You'd think it would be quite straightforward, but the warning that generally comes up is a warning attached to valproate, and is this woman of childbearing age? And again, there are two problems with that, potentially. So in some locations, the pharmacist might not even see the warning, because I've seen practice where the person dispensing it will see the warning, and you get so many flagged up that the people typing in the information into the system and generating the labels don't put it into context. Some practices, they will actually, some systems allow you to print off the more severe warning labels, and the pharmacist can then make a decision. So it's an imperfect system, and even the GP systems, until recently, one of them only had the valproate as a level 2 warning, not a level 1 warning. And it takes, I was surprised to hear this, about 2 years to change a GP system and 18 months to change something on a pharmacy system. So it was very slow to change. So the awareness really had to be through the professional channels, pharmacy media, and outlets such as that.
So my final question then is about the pregnancy protection programme.
Yeah.
Have you seen, do you know, through the community pharmacists and other pharmacies, whether there's been prescribing habits changed as a consequence of this PPP?
It's hard to say, really. I'm aware of only a very small number of women who have changed their medication, and the problem is that I think a lot of women who are on the medicine don't want to risk losing their driving licence. It has a real lifestyle impact if you change your medicine and it doesn't suit you. And if you're a busy mother, you already have children, you might be working, the thought of not being able to drive and have your car, I think, is very, very difficult for some. So I haven't noticed a lot, certainly locally, but I know in some areas of the country they've been better than others at a concerted effort to try and reduce it. But that's been more of a whole system approach, with the leading from the hospitals and quite a lot of engagement activity. But that is not universal throughout the country.
Right.
One of the things, when you said that sometimes some pharmacy systems allow you to print a warning label,
Yeah.
what happens to that label? Does it go on the box?
No, so there are warning labels that go on the box. So the labels on the sodium valproate, I think now say don't take in pregnancy anyway, but it's kind of the small print at the bottom. These are labels that are printed off. They look like dispensing labels, but they're printed off for information. So the pharmacist would look at them, assess whether there's anything that needed to be done, because occasionally you can get warnings coming up which say you've got 2 medicines for hypertension. Is this right? And actually you know it is, because they're not controlled. But if it was about sodium valproate and women of childbearing age, then that would act as a prompt to have that conversation.
Okay, so they're for internal pharmacy use, they're not external.
It's internal pharmacy use, yeah.
Right.
Can I just ask, if the pharmacist is concerned that the woman in front of him or her in the pharmacy is not on a form of contraception that's compliant with PPP, what you'd want is for the pharmacist to be able to raise that quickly with the prescriber, so something can be done very, very quickly in the woman's interests. How does that work in practice? Well,
it works in a number of ways, if I'm honest, because people work in different ways. Ideally, if you've got a good relationship with the GP, you should be able to flag that up straight away, and the GP can do that. There has been an increase in recent years, sadly, of, and I can understand this, the GPs not wanting to be disturbed. Again, this goes back to changes in practice. 40 years ago, when I rang the GP, I was always put straight through. Now the norm seems to be that unless something is flagged up as urgent, even then it just goes on their computer system, so they get a computer warning and they decide whether to take it or wait to the end of the surgery. Now, if you've got a woman who, particularly if the pharmacy is near the surgery, it helps if they can go straight back. But again, the conversation is quite a delicate one, because the woman might already have a child. The child might be unaffected. She might not be aware that the risk is so high. And there has been, not in pharmacy circles, but certainly in some of the medical circles, a discussion about whether a woman actually has a right to be pregnant knowing the risks, which I find a rather strange human rights issue. But nevertheless, those conversations have taken place. So ideally, you would be able to get through to the doctor's surgery, but sometimes if there's just a lot going on the day, making that phone call might be really difficult, and the patient might just be told to go back to the doctor. But the advice is that you should contact the GP and inform the patient and refer them back. So
because if you can't do an immediate referral back, then the woman's not got her epilepsy treatment. Presumably she's run out, she's there for the repeat prescription, she's about to run out.
Well, she would, no, because the advice is to dispense.
So you would dispense anyway?
You would dispense, because the advice is to dispense, because there's a risk to the woman in her not having her epilepsy medicine. It's not an ideal situation. Sometimes they haven't got a plan, but they are on some sort of contraception. They may not be on a long-acting form of contraception, they may not want to do that. So there are a number of different scenarios that might take place.
Does anyone keep any record centrally of how many incidents of that nature happen?
Of what nature? Those conversations?
Yes, where the woman is not on a PPP approved form of contraception but gets the medication anyway.
There was a pharmacy audit that looked at all of this, but that audit only took place over a period of a few weeks. I believe it was part of the quality payments scheme as well. So there is a snapshot in time, but the only way that information would be routinely captured would be potentially on the pharmacy patient medication record. And that is unique to that particular pharmacy. One of the larger chains shares information between their pharmacies. But nobody else would be able to access it. It would be very useful if there was some way of writing to the patient record so that a pharmacist could actually record that conversation. ideally, that's well, some pharmacies have referral forms, and there's a copy for the GP, a copy for the patient, and a copy for the pharmacy, which highlights the issue, because sometimes people say, well, I'm not really sure what's going on, what's all this about? So if you write it out in that form, and then you can make sure a copy goes to the GP, and the patient's got a copy as well. But not all GPs are aware of the importance of this either, because the GPs can speak for themselves, but in meetings at the MHRA, it's been quite clear that some GPs have had women go to their surgery. They've been called because part of the system works, and then the GP hasn't known why they're there.
Right.
Because they weren't up to date. I would hope that is a bit better now, but certainly this is less than a year ago.
But this scenario in pharmacies, as you described it, could result in different things happening. Because there's no coordination of approach or systems or records. So different pharmacies in different places will may end up doing slightly different things.
They will probably have protocols in place which they follow for referral to GP, and each company will have a slightly different system. There will be a system, but there will be slightly different.
Is whatever the outcome, or whether knowing that the person is on a PPP or not, whether planning a family or not, it will always be, here is the prescription, the pharmacist will dispense it, and then take whatever follow-up action. You can't do it immediately.
Yes.
It's supposed to be what that
Yes.
answer. So there's never a situation where you say, sorry, this is far too risky, not giving this prescription at this point.
I would hope not, because the protocol is quite clear. I'm saying that the flow diagram, I think, is very.
Comes out the same, whatever the route.
Yeah, I mean, I think the greens. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have chosen those colours personally, but
it's a go.
Well, it is a go, but it's. I think maybe green and amber might be might have been prudent. But it's these things, as you know, are designed by committee.
Can I ask you no. Can I ask a slightly different question? Medicine shortages have been in the news quite a bit recently. Are there actual concerns about availability of valproate now, and have you got concerns about supply in the future?
I'm not. There have been problems with a huge variety of medicines. I'm not aware of any long-standing problem with valproate. If we have a hard Brexit, we will be in uncharted territory with regard to medicine supply. I am aware that there is an intense amount of time, effort and probably money being devoted to making sure that supplies continue and that medicines will be made a priority. But I can understand that people are concerned. There has been some publicity about the I can never remember the name of it, sorry, the serious medicines, the shortage protocol. And there was particular concern from people with epilepsy. Now, the way this protocol is supposed to happen, emergency legislation is being passed so that in the case, if there is a severe shortage, and it has to be deemed a severe shortage by the government, then in that case, there will be discussion between consultants, pharmacists, GPs, so that everybody is clear what the alternative supply route is, what drug will be given, and if there are any occasions where the replacement can't be drug B but will have to be drug C. This will actually help patients because instead of being chucked back to the doctor, which that's not a very technical term, but they're very often referred back to the surgery, it will take that loop out and the GP will know what's being prescribed instead, so everybody will know.
So in theory, it should work?
In theory it should work, but with epilepsy drugs it's unlikely that they will form part of this because of it's often quite a fine balance in getting somebody stabilised on the right medicine. And I think the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, has already said that this medicines which are the dosage is quite critical, such as certain epilepsy drugs and drugs for transplants, they won't be covered.
So there's no chance of, say, people on one anti-epileptic being switched on to valproate, because obviously that would have implications in terms of new people coming on.
It doesn't. I'd be extremely surprised if that happened.
I'm
not never to say never, but certainly at the moment, I think those drugs would be made a priority of priorities because the government has already said that they don't plan to use the protocol for those sorts of medicines. But I can see where you're coming from because if a woman was suddenly put on valproate instead of something else, that could be really quite frightening. But I'm pretty sure that won't happen.
And the reverse, if she's put onto something else that isn't valproate.
Yeah.
Does she have to give her consent to that? Does she have to know the consequences of this change in her
any
medication?
woman being prescribed valproate would have to know the consequences of valproate, and those conversations would have to take place. But given the publicity that has been over valproate, the whole move is to try to reduce the prescribing. So we're seeing fewer younger women coming through on sodium valproate. That's the change that has been noticeable. Because they're being swapped over before they're driving and what have you, so they won't have the problems of changing drugs later on. They're sometimes difficult conversations to have because the criteria is childbearing age. So if you're talking about a 14-year-old, parents are often uncomfortable with their daughters being thought of as childbearing, but the reality and practicality of modern life is that early teens is probably a good time to start thinking about changing people over. So hopefully there will be relatively few women on sodium valproate, and already the Royal College of Psychiatrists has taken a view about the use of valproate in certain conditions and said it's just not acceptable at all. The difference with epilepsy is that is actually life-threatening, and for some women there just doesn't seem to be an alternative. So I think there will always be a very small number, but that number should decrease with time.
Right, thank you.
Just thinking about medicine use reviews and valproate, what happens at the moment? Is valproate one of the medicines where pharmacists
No, sadly, and this is something the Community Pharmacy Safety Group were quite keen on. In fact, Howard Duff, when he was director for England, did raise this with Deborah James, who was in charge of commissioning pharmacy services at the time, but it didn't really get any traction because I think we were probably slightly ahead of it being as much for government priority as it is. But it would certainly make sense for women to have that review if they're on valproate. If that was targeted, then the women would be much more likely to have a review. Some do, because you have to do a proportion of targeted to untargeted, so it could form part of your untargeted practice. But the reality is people have little pet subjects quite often that they might like doing medicines use reviews on, and that would be it. There is a concern about, there are some women who have their medicines delivered or might access via an internet pharmacy, and we are not sure what happens and whether those conversations take place on those occasions. So that is a potentially weak area of the system.
Right, thank you. So,
I gather you give advice about the off-label use of medicines in the national formulary. Is that monitored in any way?
You had me there. might be by the business statistics. Well, probably not actually, because when prescription numbers are analysed, you wouldn't have the diagnosis data. So unless somebody, potentially it could be because you could use the NHS number, but you would have to be doing some quite clever computer.
But it isn't monitored at the moment.
No, not so I'm aware of.
You say that your members read your journal, and therefore, my mother was a pharmacist, and I can remember it arriving every so often. Yes, but is there any other way that you can actually monitor the compliance of pharmacists with the advice that you give them?
It's very difficult. I gather the GPHC inspections teams are now actively looking at this, but they are
GPHC,
General Pharmaceutical Council, which is the regulator. So they're actually best placed to look at that. So as a society, it's the regulator who deals with compliance. You give the advice. Yes. We provide standards, advice, information.
And how do you connect? And one of the problems in my profession is how the Royal Colleges connect to the General Medical Council to make sure that people are practicing safely. So how does that work for you in the new arrangements you've got?
Well, we have regular meetings with the General Pharmaceutical Council. I've got one in a couple of weeks' time. So we generally share items of concern.
That would be at policy level, but not at individual member level.
No. The two organisations are separate with regard to their communications to pharmacists.
Okay. That brings me to my last question, is partly because of the other part of your life. This review has come to pass because patients have suffered, and it's taken groups of patients dedicated to bring this to the attention of society, and politicians forming associated parliamentary health groups that's led to this review being set up. So as a doctor, I feel surprised but also concerned that it took the activity of patients and politicians to draw the profession's notice to something which is going seriously wrong or has gone wrong in these areas. What could we do better as a system? I don't want to blame anybody, but what can we do better?
Well, I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about this, and I wish I knew the answer, because in the early days we thought that just greater awareness would solve the problem. So there was quite a lot of effort devoted to trying to get the message across. Sanofi produced materials, they didn't even arrive in half the pharmacies, and quite frankly the results were really disappointing, and I say that as a pharmacist, seeing the take up from pharmacy and also the awareness of GPs. So the whole system failed these women in effect, and even the consultants weren't all admitting the risks were as high as they are. And the more that this is being looked at, it seems there's more evidence seems to emerge of the problems. So one thing I have noticed is I used to regularly receive Committee of Safety of Medicines briefings to my home address, and I no longer receive those for some reason. So I'm a registered pharmacist. Can only assume they're not sending anything out. those had the advantage of if there was something of particular concern, it was probably the one thing you really made sure you read if you were doing your job properly, because it had the emerging concerns, things you could look out for, things you should be giving certain advice for, the most important problems. And I'm not convinced that those are going out anymore. I was trying to remember when I last received one, and it must have been a few years ago, so certainly before of the interest in valproate. And I think the message for all health professionals, if I am absolutely honest, is listen to the patients. Because very often there is an attitude of, I won't say doctor knows best, but pharmacist knows best as well. But, and to professionals, some paediatricians said, well, we noticed there was something going on, but nobody believed us. And the parts of the system just didn't join up and put two and two together.
Where can patients go when they have these concerns? I mean, they can go sort of everywhere, but wherever they go, nobody seems to have listened.
No, and very few patients will report an adverse drug reaction, because we now have a system where patients can report that, but I think very few do. I don't know what the figures are. And sometimes it's only when something happens a second time that you think, oh, that's odd. And start to put two and two together, because obviously there are a lot of factors in an individual pregnancy, so you wouldn't immediately associate it with sodium valproate, but somewhere along the line somebody should have noticed that a lot of the children were being affected, and I can't quite understand how that wasn't picked up earlier. And it seems to have been, some of our colleagues in France particularly seem to have been ahead of us there. I wish I had an answer, but it's not just about more information, because we all suffer from information overload. So it's how do you get emerging queries, key information out so that they are noticed, and this is your must read.
But in your position as a politician, who's sat on the health committee and a practicing pharmacist, you do have an important perspective of these issues. So if any ideas occur to you, will you?
I will. I have thought about it, and I really wish I knew, because quite a lot of, so what was evident in one of the MHRA stakeholder events, I'm not trying to apportion blame, but the CCGs all had to have a plan in place, and they had to communicate the importance of valproate to the GPs. Well, a lot of the GPs, the letters had gone out, but not every GP in every practice had seen it, because sometimes there's a lead GP and they may not have felt fit to inform the other GPs. So, and you look at the number of medications we have, medicines we have these days compared to a few years ago. I mean, my first BNF was one of those little pocket-sized ones, and now it's quite chunky. So. And again, with all the new medicines, it increases the opportunity for something to do well. But you ask all the CCGs, and they're very smug, and they tick the box and said, we've done our bit. But if it has no impact, then there's no point in just creating a paper trail for the sake of it. So I don't know how you can make people individually accountable to this. I suppose one way, if there was something deemed of sufficient importance, would be to make it part of the annual declaration. I don't know if it's the same for doctors, but certainly when I renew my pharmacy registration every year, there's a number of questions I have to ask. Most of them about whether I've had a speeding ticket or, I'm not well. But that could be used to say, are you aware of
Do you have a personal
XYZ?
appraisal system like they've introduced into medicine, where you sit down with a colleague, a peer, who and you have to produce evidence and so on.
Yes, well, the system's changing, so peer review is coming in this year, along with, I think, a reflective essay. How much that can be used for that, I don't know, but I think almost any solution has to have a regulatory element, otherwise I don't think it will happen, is my... I'm reluctant to say that, but that's the conclusion I've come to after following this issue for a few years.
Okay.
Yes, can I ask a question? You were talking about the manufacturers not getting the materials into the pharmacies in relation to sodium valproate, and one of the issues I know was about the pack size.
Yes.
So that if the pack size was large, it meant that the pharmacist would be breaking open those packs, putting them in the white boxes, the patient information leaflet was not going in. We have been told that that is all resolved now, and as of October that should be the case. Is that your experience?
Well, I haven't seen so many of the smaller packs actually. There's still quite a lot of large ones in the system, but all pharmacies have been sent, it's a bright purple folder so that it stands out a mile, and in that are supplies of stickers and things, but that is the bit that will sometimes, in all honesty, be missed. And the conversation I have very often is they need X, and the automatic response, particularly if it's a pharmacy where they know the patient well, is, oh, they've had it before.
So I was told the pack size itself, the original manufacturer, is gone from 100 down to 30, so that should be, every pack will come with its own PIL.
It will, but well, there should be a PIL in anyway.
It should be,
but
they're not put in the white boxes always.
There's still a lot of old packs in the system. But
right, so we're not there yet.
Not there yet. But it's only a matter of time, because
that's what should happen.
Yeah.
When the box is broken down and put into white boxes, there are stickers.
There are stickers, and most people
pharmacies have them.
Yeah, they're part of this purple folder.
Yeah. Do they use them?
Well, evidence would suggest not in all cases, because I've seen photos of where they haven't been used.
I have another question, which really goes back to where we started when we started talking about Primodos, and it's linked to that, but there is a modern day concern, I suppose, about it. The prescription reimbursement scheme as such, we learnt that Primodos was no longer to be reimbursed after 1970, I believe, after the McGregor Committee reported, and that the indication to use it as a pregnancy test was removed. But I also know, from looking at the past historic records, that the secondary amenorrhea, the treatment for which Primodos did have a license, was in fact exactly the same dosage, same composition of ingredients, same number of times to be taken as the test for pregnancy. When a doctor writes on a prescription what it is he wants prescribed, he doesn't, as now, and presumably then, say what he wanted it prescribed for. So he writes the prescription. In terms of this issue of what could be reimbursed, how would the prescription pricing authority know what the drug was actually being issued for?
They wouldn't in that case.
So in fact that was a lever that really had no control.
Well, historically, a lot of it is computer checked these days anyway, because they're all scanned. But the 70s were in the days of handwritten prescriptions, and with handwritten prescriptions you're less likely to get any indication on the prescription than you are now. Some practices will often put an indication for a drug, but it's by no means universal, and it's more common for the pharmacist just to be presented with the prescription with no indication of
what it was for.
So it would be exceedingly helpful if pharmacists could have access to the medical, the clinical records. And if there was a compunction, then to check, double check Baroness Cumberledge mentioned that one of our strengths was checking. But at the moment, with the summary care record, I don't think even that would be, the major, if there's a major diagnosis, that's there, but you not everything.
So in the past, sorry, just following up, so in the past, the notion that those pregnancy tests would not be reimbursed was sort of an irrelevance because no one would know whether it was given for secondary amenorrhea or a pregnancy test.
I would have to double. It's hard to check back in the 70s, but for some medicines, so for example, there are some oral contraceptives that can be prescribed for acne and not oral contraception, and the GP has to mark that as for contraceptive purposes if it's for contraception. But that is only because the woman then doesn't pay, but if she has acne she has to pay. So there are mechanisms that could be brought in to flag up whether something needs to be done or what the indication is, but there would have to be it's usually a financial reason. It doesn't happen.
Historically, going back to the 1970s, were diagnostic tests put on the same form as prescriptions?
I can't really answer that, I'm afraid, because I only qualified in 1979.
No, I wasn't implying personally.
But I can't recall seeing it. Well, you say diagnostic tests, but there have always been things like testing, urine testing strips.
But were they put on prescriptions?
They're on prescriptions, yes.
Okay.
And there's a list of what is allowed, but obviously if a diagnostic test is also allowed as a drug for another indication, then it wouldn't be much help.
Well, Sandra, thank you so much. It's been really, really useful. I'm just going to ask my colleagues if there are any final questions they would like to ask or points they want to make. So,
no, thank you.
No, thank you.
No.
All right.
Okay, if you think of anything that you need more information on, then such as the early 70s, which I don't think happened, but if you contact us, we might be able to find out, get our library onto it.
Okay, very knowledgeable and